Hi everyone, it's so lovely to be here with you this evening. I'm going to share some slides in a minute so everyone can kind of keep track as I talk through, but I just wanted to introduce myself first. Firstly, just to say, yeah, I'm Elspeth. As you know, I've seen everyone saying in the chat that it seems to be very hot and sunny where everyone is today. I'm based in Edinburgh. It's also very hot here today, like very unusual for Edinburgh. So yeah, thanks very much for taking the time to be here this evening, especially on such a beautiful day, although I imagine some people are probably taking refuge from the heat indoors. And yeah, thank you so much for joining from all over the UK. And I think we also have someone from Brazil as well. So yeah, thanks so much for taking the time to join from different places. So just to introduce myself first, I sorry, I'm just gonna turn the chat off just so that I'm not getting distracted all the time. But yeah, so Anna just said, please pop questions in the chat. Please feel free to do that throughout. I know sometimes it can be difficult to remember a question at the end if something jogged it in the beginning. So please do just say any time in the chat, but I'll come to your questions at the end. So we'll have plenty of time for that. And just a couple of words about me. I'm a writer and a poet. I also am very interested in accessibility, mental health and disability issues. This will probably come up a little bit in the talk tonight about how I write about nature. So if you're sitting there feeling like maybe you're shielding, or maybe you aren't able to get out much for whatever other reason, there'll be a lot in the discussion tonight about how I write about nature from a perspective of someone who lives in the middle of a city in a flat without a garden, and things that I do kind of about nature and domestic spaces as well. So yeah, just to reassure you about that, and just say a little bit about my writing. Kind of working on a nature writing book at the moment. My nature writing was shortlisted for the Canongate Nan Shepherd Prize for underrepresented writers in nature writing. So again, very interested in kind of like diversifying the voices that there are in nature writing. Cool, I'm gonna share my screen now, and I will just do that quickly. Hopefully you can all see that now. Just give me a thumbs up if you can see that. Cool, okay, well, fab. So yeah, this is how I write about nature, and thanks again for everyone for being here, and also for Anna for hosting me. The emphasis on this is very much how I write about nature. So this is things that have worked for me, and I very much hope that there will be things that you can take away here too. But if anything doesn't ring true for you for whatever reason, please feel free to, take what works for you and leave what doesn't, as with, any kind of writing feedback or writing practice. Make this your own as much as possible and as much as you want. And I'll be very interested to hear from you as well if you have any comments or reflections throughout, and of course any questions. So this is just going to be, I've got a little overview here of what we're going to be talking about today. So firstly, I'm going to outline some things that are helpful for me. Secondly, I'm going to talk about how I write about difficult topics, obviously conscious of the fact that not everyone has an easy or straightforward relationship with nature, and also obviously a lot of nature writing, and many people, including myself, feel is a duty to kind of write about climate crisis if we're writing about nature writing a lot, and those things can be difficult to write about. Which brings me on to me talking a little bit about how I retain hope. So that will be a little bit more about writing practice. So yeah, some things that I do in terms of kind of writerly self-care to retain and maintain hope whilst writing about more difficult topics. Then I'm going to read a very short poem that I have written, which is kind of combines some of the things that I've talked about, and then we'll have time for any questions or comments. Cool. Okay, so firstly, things that are helpful for me when I am writing about nature. So drawing on what's around you, I'm going to expand on this, but I just firstly wanted to say something up front, which is that writing about nature, I firmly believe, like nature writing can come in fiction, non-fiction, poetry, a mix. It can come across all genres, whatever form we're writing in. So if you're sat there and you mostly write fantasy, I've definitely, for example, read fantasy books that I consider to have lots of nature writing within them, the same for science fiction. Obviously, there's a lot of nature writing, and what we might think of as nature writing shelved in a bookshop or a library is often non-fiction or memoir or essay collections, and that's great and amazing too. But I just wanted to say that, you know, you can take what is discussed today into any kind of writing practice that you want. And when I run nature writing courses and classes, I'm always conscious of that as well, that there's definitely people in the room who are perhaps fiction writers, and I'm conscious of that and think that you can very much kind of take all these things away, think about place as character and setting as character as well in different genres. So in terms of drawing on what's around you, these are things that really helped me to write about nature, particularly in the last year, last year and a half now, when me, and I'm sure lots of other people here, have very much been confined, or however you want to look at it, but situated in a much smaller area than perhaps previously. So in terms of writing nature from the everyday, something that I find very helpful in my own writing practice is to try and train my eye to notice the little things around me. So what I mean by that is trying to kind of, when you're walking, even if it's a walk that you do every day, to do it in quite a mindful way and start thinking about what's around you and taking notice of it more actively. So for example, the other day, there's a beach near where I live, which I can walk on, and I walk there all the time. But the other day I noticed that there was a jellyfish there, like a dried up crispy jellyfish. And I thought that was really cool, because I thought, you know, you could write about it situated in this beach in Edinburgh, but on the other hand, it's come on this huge journey. How did it get there? That kind of thing. So I think it's about training my eye to notice that. And something which is really helpful in that is keeping a nature journal. So what I mean by this is just somewhere, it can be a physical journal, it can be audio dictation on your phone, it can be your notes app, just somewhere where when you notice those little unusual things, to write it down, or not necessarily unusual, but maybe just something which really catches your eye that day, a change in weather, a change in the season, whatever it is. I think as writers, we always think, oh, we'll remember that, but I personally find that I actually don't remember those things. And then when I look back in them, it's almost like a little kind of set of writing prompts, but ones that you've made from yourself. So yeah, I think that kind of training your eye to notice in that way can be really helpful for writing about nature. And if it's accessible for you, I think writing outside can help that as well, because obviously you can use all the senses available to you to do that, and it can kind of put you in a different mood, in a different place. That's something that really helps me when I write about nature, is to kind of, yeah, get outside if it's possible. And there's a great nature writer called Natasha Carthew who says that one good thing, especially if you do that in winter, is like you kind of have to concentrate, because you can only stay out for a certain amount of time if it's quite cold, so it kind of forces you to concentrate as well, which I think is quite nice as well. Something else that is very helpful to me is thinking about how journeys don't have to be geographically big. So again, I think this relates to the everyday and how we can draw on nature around us all the time, including in domestic spaces, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So I think when I am writing about nature, I think thinking about a journey can be helpful, but it doesn't have to be a geographical journey. Obviously, maybe some people can write about really long journeys in places where they're not from, where they've traveled to, etc., or maybe they're in quite extreme conditions, whatever it is, and that can be really cool to read about too. But for a lot of us, whether that's because of financial reasons, disability, caring responsibilities, that's not going to be accessible. But that doesn't mean, you know, in my writing that I can't take the reader on a journey. So I think often it's helpful for me to think about leaving the reader somewhere different from where they were, where they started, whatever you're writing about. And for me, I think that something quite helpful in doing that is thinking about the kind of like emotional journey of a piece of nature writing, as well as kind of maybe the physical journey that I've been on in it. Obviously, not all nature writing has to be a journey, but it's something that I find quite helpful for framing my own writing, especially if I'm not quite sure how to structure something. I think a journey can be a really nice place to start. And when I say a journey, I mean I often write about things like local walks that I do regularly, even have written about a piece kind of out of the view from a certain window whilst walking from one room to the other in my flat. So I mean, really, like, journeys can be these very like familiar, intimate, quite local things. I can recommend any pieces later on if anyone's interested, but there's a great piece by Angela Reedman, which won the nature writing, the Working Class Nature Writers Award last year in 2020, called Round and Round the Garden, which is her doing a journey, literally walking round and round her garden. But it's a very beautiful piece, and whenever I share it in workshops, it really resonates with people. So I think, again, that's just to say that, you know, there's all kinds of journeys that we can take people in nature writing. And yeah, lastly, it doesn't matter where you are, there's always nature. I think this is something that I, again, kind of need to remind myself when I'm doing my own writing, but it's really helpful for me in thinking how I write about nature, is to kind of, again, try and see in that way where I'm mindful of what I'm noticing and what's around me. Because again, as I mentioned before, I live in the middle of a city and I don't have a garden and things. So I think that there's been times, maybe especially over lockdown, where I felt a bit frustrated by that. But it's really helpful for me to start kind of thinking about things differently, and it actually has really helped my sense of place and relationship where I've been, to try and notice the nature that's around us all the time. Because, you know, that can be things like seagulls pulling rubbish from bins, or, you know, like foxes, like urban foxes, or, you know, like even things like maybe the kind of nature that we don't always love, like a spider in our house and things. So I think that's very helpful for me when writing about nature, to think about those things as well. Which moves me on to thinking about nature in domestic spaces, which is, yeah, something which I find very helpful in my own writing practice as well. So again, this has been particularly useful for me over lockdown, and when thinking about, I suppose, yeah, in periods of illness or self-isolation, I think it can be really helpful to think about this as well for my writing. So nature is everywhere, even in the home. You don't have to leave the house. I think that's really helpful for me to remember on days perhaps where that just like doesn't feel accessible to me for whatever reason. And I've written, try the writing from your window exercise here, because I think something that really helps me write about nature as a way to get into starting about it, to write about it, is to sit at a window in my flat and literally just free write based on what I can see outside. This is something that can be done using, you know, all the senses available that, you know, each individual has available to them. And I don't think it really matters whether, you know, where you look out onto. I've done this from different places, you know, places that look out on somewhere which is kind of very, you know, picturesque, or somewhere which looks out just onto other buildings. And I think it's really interesting to see for myself, if I do this exercise on different days and just repeat it just for 10 minutes of free writing, it can be a really good way to get into nature writing, because I think you're going to see changes in what you write, even if it's just kind of like doing it for like 3 days for 10 minutes. You know, there'll be changes in things like the weather, yeah, what's kind of like maybe the time of day that you're writing at, and writing about the weather, you know, that's nature writing in and of itself. So I think thinking about nature in domestic spaces, thinking about things like the fruit that I might have in my kitchen, vegetables in the fridge, you know, anything like any wooden furniture I have around, this has been really helpful for me at times when I felt stuck about nature writing, to just kind of use that as a prompt and get creative with it and see where it goes. Which brings me on to something which for me in how I write about nature is really important. So I've written, what even is nature? And by having different perspectives, which include the domestic, we can start to question and problematize the idea of nature. So I think in writing about nature, this is something that's really important for me to do as both a writer and a reader, in that I think, you know, we brought up with these ideas about what nature is, and they're quite idealized. And also we often have this kind of binary between like urban and wild, and kind of like rural and urban and things. And I think it can be quite a narrow vision, or at least when I was brought up with what was displayed to me, or kind of, yeah, the connotations around nature were in some ways quite narrow, and certainly in nature writing historically, it's been like dominated by kind of like a white perspective, a non-disabled perspective, often a man's perspective. And I think for my own writing, it's really useful for me to start kind of thinking a bit more critically about that, and like, okay, what do I think of as nature? An example of this is when I was living in Dublin. I lived in Dublin for quite a while, and we lived right in the inner city in North Dublin, and there wasn't very many parks nearby. And I think that I very much had in my head like, oh, I'm so far removed from nature, there's no nature around me. But then actually when I started to kind of think about what I felt about nature differently, and think about it a bit more critically, I realized, you know, there were actually quite a lot of flowers, there was small city parks. It just maybe wasn't what I had been brought up to consider as kind of like wild and natural. And in turn, that led to a piece of nature writing that I've written that I really liked, which kind of talks about that. And, you know, I discuss my own preconceptions and biases within that. So I think that can be like a really interesting place for me at least, to explore and to think about, like, you know, it's not necessarily, nature doesn't mean the same thing to everybody. We all have our own personal relationship with nature, and I think almost, like, no pun intended, but denaturalizing what we think of as nature and our own personal relationship can be really helpful. So even if it's just asking myself questions like, what do I think of as nature, that can then, and writing a bit about that can then for me lead to kind of more creative freedom and more, I suppose, like, diversity in my own writing about what I choose to write about. And the next point I really wanted to bring up is just for myself, it's really helpful for me, again, to remind myself, it's okay to be honest about what you know and what you don't know, and it's okay not to know things. So my background, as I said, I'm very interested in things like gender, sexuality, feminism, and disability, and I have kind of some background in that because I used to work in public health research, but I'm very much not an expert on anything kind of like in the way of nature or natural. Like, I'm not a botanist, I'm not a climate scientist, and I think, you know, maybe when I was younger I'd have definitely thought, oh, that kind of precludes me from writing about nature, but actually I think, you know, I love reading nature writing from all different perspectives, and I absolutely believe that there's room for everybody. So I think that's just, something that has really helpful for me to kind of think about, and how I write about nature is it's okay not to know things, and actually something I find really interesting is exploring what I don't know as well. So that's kind of similar to what I was just saying there about exploring my own thoughts on nature, and like what nature is. I think it can be really interesting for me to think about, oh, like, why do I know this thing and not that thing? Or why is it that, for example, I know the names of quite a lot of flowers just because I learned them growing up, but kind of not very many kind of like insects or like shrubs, or like, why is it that we privilege flowers? It's not something I've ever written about, but just kind of saying off the top of my head now can be interesting to think about those things. And again, I think if you're kind of thinking about what to write about, it can be quite interesting to kind of think about some of your assumptions, some of your knowledge, and use that as a jumping off point. But I just also wanted to write a little note to say, if you are an expert, that's great too, just in case there's any experts in the room. I'm saying this more as how I read about nature than how I write about nature as myself as a non-expert. But I think it's really cool to, when I do read books by people who are experts on any particular aspect, I find that really fascinating as well. But it just comes back again to kind of read nature writing from all different perspectives. I'm just going to bring up one more point actually from that slide as well, because I think this got written at the end there. You can write about your expert area alongside anything else you want. One way that I find really helpful to think about nature writing and how I write about nature in a way that's more like freeing creatively for me personally is just to remember that I can write about nature alongside anything else. So, you know, nature writing, it can be, you can write about kind of like nature and sex, or nature and politics, or nature and economics, or, as I said, nature in a fantasy novel. Like, it's very much something that we can use as a tool to write about in like wider context. We can write about whatever we want. I think sometimes, again, like probably the nature writing that I read when I was younger, and maybe the way that nature's sometimes spoken about, can be quite rarefied and idealized. So I just think that's really helpful for me when thinking about writing nature, is to think, okay, like, what can I write about nature, kind of like nature and. So I'm going to just talk briefly about how I write about difficult topics after sharing some of those points around kind of, how it's useful to me to think about nature and to kind of think about nature in the everyday and domestic spaces. So firstly, climate crisis. As I said, I think that this, again, it just has to be acknowledged that a lot of nature writing is going to, by necessity, touch upon climate crisis and habitat destruction, and that can be a really difficult thing both to write and read about. One of the ways that I find is helpful to write about it is, again, from an inexpert perspective. I'm not a climate scientist, I don't have any expertise in the area, but I feel like for me, what I feel like I can add in a way that helps me to write about it, and it's very useful for me as well, as I suppose like an act of catharsis, is to talk about the feelings associated with climate change. So the anxiety, the grief, the frustrations that are there. And that really helps me when I write about climate crisis, because often it's written from a place of me talking about, for example, you know, conflicted feelings. Like we were all talking about how it's so hot in many places in the UK, but this is like, you know, it's not. I know that at the moment there's the first severe weather warning to do with heat in the UK ever. Like it's these funny feelings you get where you're conflicted because, well, at least I am, because I'm like, it's gorgeous weather and I want to enjoy it, but then you also feel, I feel anxious about the fact that the weather is that hot. So I think, you know, it's like acknowledging that complexity there. That really helps me, the kind of complexity, the feelings when writing about climate crisis. The other thing that is very helpful in my own writing is to think, and this may come out on the page or it may just be something that I hold on to for myself, but is to write from a place of action. And what I mean by that is to believe in the possibility of change. I recently saw something that was talking, it was a review of a book which is climate fiction, this kind of new genre that's, kind of been coined as a new genre. And it was a review of a book from climate fiction, and it was saying that, you know, they felt that the reviewer was saying that the author does what writers can do now, which is only to document climate change. And that is very different from how I write about nature and climate change. Like I still very much believe in the possibility of change, improvements, making things better. Obviously each to their own, but that I felt personally that was very defeatist way of thinking about how to write about nature and the environment. So for me, I'll touch on this a little bit again later, but it's very important to write about climate crisis in a way that I feel like there is room for change and room for action and room for writing about the environment to influence that. And then lastly, something which is very important for me as a writer and a reader is to find pockets of joy and hope when writing about climate crisis. So I think, you know, still thinking deeply about the relationships I have with places, with animals, thinking about, again, the trajectory and the journey within a piece of nature writing, how, you know, there will be maybe moments of profound sadness if you're going to be writing about climate crisis or habitat destruction, but where you're starting with the reader and where you're ending them, you know. And I think often for me in my writing, if it's about something around climate crisis, I like to kind of have both of those points as relatively hopeful, especially the ending. Just having moments of levity in there for me in my writing, I find it both makes it easier for me to write it, but also as a reader, I think that, you know, we've probably all had the experience of reading, I don't know, maybe something which is kind of like on the crime end of the spectrum, and there's just like murder after murder, and you sort of like feel, maybe this is just me, but feel a bit numb to it because you're just like, oh my gosh, and another character bites the dust or whatever. I do think there can be like equivalents of that in you know, writing about really serious topics. If it's all overwhelmingly shocking and like stressful and appalling, people will find that really like it might make them switch off sometimes. So I think, you know, rightly or wrongly, that just is the case. I think that's, again, important for me, both as a writer and a reader, to think about that kind of trajectory that the reader will go on when they're reading it. And then to move on to how I write about a sometimes difficult relationship with the outdoors. So for a little bit of background on this, I have, sometimes I found the outdoors, like being outside, quite difficult. Obviously, again, talked about how nature writing doesn't have to be about the outdoors, but for me, when I am outside, that can be a bit difficult because I have extremely sensitive hearing and can get quite anxious about like noises and things. Obviously there's a lot of noises when you're outside, and various other things kind of around mental health and anxiety, which sometimes make it quite difficult for me when I am outside. But I think that something that is really important for me to hold on to is that it doesn't have to be perfect. So again, sometimes when we speak about nature, it can be quite idealized, but you know, it doesn't have to be perfect. I think, you know, it's actually really important for me to write about those more difficult experiences in the hope that that's relatable for some other people out there. I know for myself as a reader, it can be really almost just relieving to be able to read about other people's experiences who maybe don't have a straightforward relationship with the natural world, who maybe sometimes find being outdoors really difficult, who might find the heat really difficult, etc. That's been something that's been really comforting for me as a reader, and I think that's something in my own writing that I really want to acknowledge, that it's not always, you're sometimes going to go on a walk and it's going to be like cold and miserable and wet and you're not enjoying it, or you're going to be seeing the most beautiful view in front of you but your mind is racing and you're really anxious. Like that's something I very much want to include when I write about nature, and it is how I write about nature. There's very much, I try and be honest, I think, about what's there. And I put that below as well, telling it like it is. And I do really believe that people want to read about difficulties as well. It goes back to what I was saying about nature writing, being able to, you know, like it's a broad church. There's lots of different things that we can write about nature alongside. And I think, yeah, it's really important to me in my own writing practice to explore, yeah, it's a way of relating with the world for me as well as a writer, to explore those more difficult parts is one of the key things that I think has been most interesting for me in learning about myself and my personal relationship with nature in my writing. The last thing I would just say there is about protecting yourself, though, at the same time. Like, this is something that I'm learning, but it is part of how I write about nature as well. I think there can be, especially if we're from a sort of like, if you have an identity which is at all kind of marginalized or underrepresented in any way, there can often be a bit of pressure, I think, that, you know, is put on us, but also I know that I put on myself to kind of, if I'm going to write about something which is more difficult, then to also to kind of like bear everything. And if someone wants to do that, that's absolutely fine, but it's also not something, you know, that's like a necessity. So again, I guess it's just about choosing what you share. And that's something that I think is really important when thinking about the kind of nature writing that I write, which is like more of the memoir essay style nature writing. And I think, yeah, it's just about, for me and how I write about nature, is about addressing the difficulties, but thinking as well, like, what do I want to share and what do I not? And so, yeah, I just wanted to share a couple of things about how I retain and maintain hope. So I think acknowledging that it can be difficult, some things can be difficult to write about to do with nature, is a really important place to start. Again, like, I love being outdoors most of the time. I love just walking, like I love swimming. So I think sometimes that can create a bit of like a rose tinted view in my head, where if I do write about something more difficult, it can almost feel like a bit sad about it, or like acknowledging that, you know, I think in my memories I can be a little bit rose tinted, but I think acknowledging that it can be difficult and that's totally fine. Like, it can be fine to find nature writing difficult. Like, it doesn't have to flow, just like any other kind of writing I think can be really difficult. Maybe it does flow, but you still find it a little bit sensitive, or you feel a bit vulnerable when you're writing it. So these are just a few things that help me in my own writing. I think sometimes, yeah, taking breaks, I mean that both in the sense of taking breaks when you're writing. I quite like writing in 15-minute chunks. That really helps me. I wrote my novel in 15-minute chunks, like obviously over a long period of time, but like for me it really works. I have quite a short attention span, so it can really help me to concentrate. And also, if it is something difficult, setting a timer on your phone and knowing that I just have that amount of time is really, really helpful for me. But also, I think something that is helpful for me is if I do delve into something which is like perhaps a more difficult thing about writing about nature, if it's to do with climate crisis, for example, it can be really helpful for me to kind of like take a break in between projects as well. So like, if I've been working on some poems around that, but then I'm going on to work on something else, I'll be conscious of having some time in between, but also maybe thinking about, is there something else that I can work on which is different to that next? Practicing self-care, I try really hard to still do the things that I really love doing in nature. For example, for me, that's like sea swimming. I love swimming in the sea, and that kind of goes back to what I was saying about having those moments of joy, even in an era of climate crisis. And something I always ask when I run a workshop about writing climate crisis is that I always ask participants to commit to one nice thing that they can do for themselves in nature and to foster their relationship with nature, and to write that down and make sure that they do that for themselves. And then lastly, again, I touched on this a little before, but just to say, for me, it's very helpful to believe in the power of writing, and I suppose nature writing specifically, to affect change, to change lives, thoughts, opinions, and actions. I know as a reader, and I'm sure other people here, probably everyone here has had the same experience of you reading certain books and then really changing your mind. And maybe, you know, that doesn't translate for us drastically changing our life the next day, but over time we're shaped by what we read, we both in kind of like what we agree with and reaction against it, and we kind of do change accordingly to that. So I feel like there's lots of nature writing that has kind of made me aware of things that I wasn't before, and for me that's really important to hold on to if it is sometimes difficult to write about something, because it kind of gives me hope. And I definitely believe in kind of like hopeful writing even about difficult things, as hopefully has been clear by this. Cool. I'm just gonna quickly, what time is it? Cool. I'm just gonna quickly read one poem, because I don't think we maybe have time to do both, but hopefully this kind of like maybe captures some of the points that I was talking about in my own writing, this is like kind of some of the things that I've been saying and how they've come together for my own nature writing. So this is just a very short poem called Eating Pringles on the Beach Alone. Hopefully you can see it through the screen share now. And just a little bit of background on this poem. I wrote this is very much like, again, on the beach, which was local to where my parents lived, so it wasn't somewhere far away. And I just saw a young person who was just kind of like, obviously like in a bit of a bad mood, chilling at the beach, and kind of wrote from their perspective. So it's very much, yeah, just something I saw in the local area and kind of used as inspiration. So the poem is called Eating Pringles on the Beach Alone. Salt rests on my tongue, my eyes, my ears, the nostril where I got the piercing just so everyone could hate it. The other people on the beach mine the sand for treasures like a parent should for knits and hair. Their bodies combs, their smiles jagged. I sit still. The waves lick me with their rough tongues. Like a kitten, I want to be nursed. A seagull is my only visitor. We stare each other down, knowing one of us will lose. I throw it a crisp because you never know once you've planted a seed where it might grow. Cool, so yeah, it's just a little example. And I'm gonna stop sharing that now. And, oh, actually, I'll just put up my socials on the screen if that's okay. Anna, can I just, sorry, I did screen share before I should have done. Fab, I will just pop them up on the screen so that you can just sort of see where to get in touch with me. If you have any follow-up questions or anything, I would love to hear from you. And I'll just leave them up for a moment so everyone can take a note. That's my Instagram, my Twitter. I probably post a lot more nature stuff on Instagram. Like I'd like to post kind of pictures of flowers and trees and things if anyone likes that kind of content. But also I have a website as well, and you can sign up to my newsletter there. I run a lot of free or pay what you can writing workshops. A lot of them are on nature writing. So yeah, if you want to kind of hear about them, please do sign up. And yeah, if anyone has any questions after this which don't get answered in the discussion, please do let me know because I'd love to hear from you. But yeah, I'll stop there and hand over to you again, Anna. Thanks so much for listening.
Lovely, thank you, Tom. Like, it was lovely to hear like your poem at the end. I feel like that's a sort of real, I hope it inspired me just because it wasn't, I hope you don't mind me saying, it wasn't like overly complex, and it wasn't really long, and it wasn't like, it doesn't have to be sort of, like you say, like really idealized or perfect or anything. It was just about a person sitting in nature and kind of interacting with it. And yeah, really nice.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for saying that, Anna. No, don't mind at all. I'm going to stop this share now just so that I can actually see people. I can put it up again if people want it later. But yeah, I don't mind you saying. I think that, yeah, and like it feels a bit gauche, like reading your own poem. Like I never choose my own poems for workshop or anything, but then I thought, okay, it's how I write about nature and this is how I do it. So I might as well share that. I think that, yeah, and also like, again, it feels a bit gauche to say, I don't want to brag, but that was like, it was in a Young Poets Network, it was highly commended. So again, like it just shows that you can like write a poem which is like about something in nature, local, and people will respond to that and really like it. And there's one more poem I'll post in the chat. We didn't have time to read it, but another poem that I wrote, which is also in the Young Poets Network, which is kind of about like twilight and climate crisis. If there's time at the end, I'll read it just because this again just kind of shows, I suppose, like it's sort of about having like a Twilight movie marathon and being anxious about climate change. It's just, again, like, yeah, you can write about like pop culture and nature, you can write about like binge watching TV and nature. Like I feel like everything is very much yeah, open.
I really like it, and I hope that when you posted the link in the chat that you saw that there's lots of love for your poem in there. And anyone watching on YouTube will pop the links for that into the little description at the bottom, so you can find everything you want there. I've got a few of my own questions. A couple have popped up in the chat as well. Can I just clarify, Round and Round the Garden, the sort of writing you spoke about, who was that read that? Sorry,
I'll just pop it in the chat now. It's by Andrea Reedman, and but I can find it, like while we're chatting, I'll find it, I'll post it in the chat. It won the I'll put this in the chat as well, the Working Class Nature Writers Prize, which is set up by Natasha Carthew. And definitely if anyone like is from a working class background, like I would definitely encourage you to look at that again when it runs next year. I think it's just closed this year, but it's really cool. Natasha Carthew is really great, and writes a lot about like sort of like rural like rural working class characters, which I feel like weirdly there's like none of in lots of literature, and the prize is really like really cool, in the writing that came out of it last year. I'm really looking forward to seeing what comes out this year, because that piece from Angela is really amazing.
Well, lovely. Thank you so much for sharing that. It sounds like a really cool piece. Can I focus back on you and ask how you got into writing?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned about when I was in Dublin, and how when I was living there, I kind of started thinking a bit more about like, what do I actually think of as nature? So kind of writing about nature. I do write fiction as well, and it's not so much nature related, but that was one of my main routes into writing, was to start writing about nature. So if anyone here hasn't written much before, for me it was a really amazing way to kind of start doing it, because so much of it is already there. Like, you do already have a personal relationship with nature, you just might not have thought about it that much before, and that was how I found it was for me. And I was also a bit lonely. I didn't have many friends in Dublin at the time. Like, I kind of just moved and was finding it quite hard to meet people. And what in that kind of period, I felt like my kind of relationship, I suppose, with place probably deepened a bit, because I had a bit more spare time and was kind of just like seeking out places in that way. I suppose, like, it sounds a bit glib, but I do feel like sort of like certain parts and things started to feel like friends. And even going there, like, again, it's like that idea of, for me, like the idea of kind of nature being like a pristine place, like, really never was there in my nature writing, because like, I guess I went there partly because if you're in a park, like, you might not be with friends, but there will be other people with friends, like, who are with friends there, and like, it feels quite communal and like quite a, like, the kind of community space that we don't actually have very many of. So yeah, I kind of started writing from that.
And like, did you start writing poems? Was it straight into a novel? What kind of thing was it?
No, it was more like scraps, and I mean that in a good way. Like, I write, well, I don't do it so much now, actually, I think, because I don't commute anymore because of lockdown, but I very much wrote like everything for like a year and a half in my notes app on my phone. So it would just be like kind of what I was saying, but I didn't have anything as nice as a nature journal. Like, it was literally just in the notes app and in my phone. So yeah, I just would write things like, I don't know, yeah, like daffodils in King's Park, or then sometimes it would be like just like something as short as that, and then sometimes an actual line. And then I think for me, the place where like the editing and the kind of like translating comes in is like either transferring that into a notebook and then onto my computer, or transferring it straight onto the computer. So for me, I find it really helpful to have things in a different place before they go into a Word document, because then my brain like edits them when they get there, if that makes sense, as they go.
Yeah. Totally. Loads of people have talked about how, like, because it's really obviously labor intensive writing in a notebook and then transferring it onto a computer, but there's also almost like this editing process that happens, and like exactly the same with working from your phone or working from dictation. Like, there's a sort of editing that happens from putting that into something else.
Definitely. Yeah, no, I totally find that. And then I feel like for me, the last stage is to like read it aloud, or not the last stage, because I probably do that like 20 times, but like I do read everything, even really long form stuff I write, do read it aloud, because I feel like for me, that really helps for the editing as well.
Nice. So you've talked about like writing, starting writing when you were in Dublin. So that was obviously somewhere you were. Angela has, as Nadia asked, how can we write about places that we don't know very well, or even that we haven't been there? Like, how would you approach that?
Yeah, I think this is something interesting, because obviously I think that like people do this like in world building, and like if you read sort of like these fantasy, there's a book I read recently called The Jasmine Throne by Tasha Suri, which is a fantasy book but had a lot of like nature in its magic system. Might be interesting for Nadia or anyone else who's interested to think about kind of like world building and nature, to read that, because I do think it's kind of that same thing. Like, even if it's somewhere we've not been but is real rather than a fantasy world, it is still an element of world building there, because we've not been there, we don't know, it has to be a construction. I think that if that were me, it's a really interesting question. I think if it was me, I would probably do kind of what I do around what I was saying around the window, but can do it with that place. So either there's like getting some like either a live feed or some pictures of the place, and kind of using that as a prompt, but using all the senses that are available to me. So like, yeah, hearing, all the other senses, sorry, they're gone now. All the other senses, and kind of like working through them. So thinking, if I was in this place, what would I smell, you know? And then probably just trying some of the other exercises that I really like to do. So writing about a journey, like maps can be amazing if you don't know a place, like, because obviously a map is kind of like a story, like it's like a million stories all at once, and it's kind of like deciphering it and seeing where the stories lie. So I would start to think, yeah, kind of probably for me, I'd use some visual prompts to prompt what it would be like for other senses, and then build up a bigger picture from there, and then start to kind of map some journeys on a map. But that's just me, and I'd be really interested if anyone else in the chat had any other ideas about how to write about nature in different places. But I do think reading some fantasy and seeing how they well build in like sort of like natural places could be quite cool for that as well. There's another one I'll put in the chat now called the Bone Shard, which is like a really cool sort of like imagined world of floating islands that migrate like every 20 years and things. So again, like kind of thinking about some things like that I think could be cool, and then like paring it down to kind of like back to the real world.
Nice, great answer. I was I would never, I was never sure. People say write about what you know, and I've always felt sad about that, because I was like, it's really lovely to write about things you don't know and explore things, and actually that's a really great way into exploring a place you don't know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, someone's just put in the chat as well, like smelling herbs and spices. So yeah, great idea. Like if you know that you're going somewhere and you can actually capture that smell, something that's used regularly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think again, it's like about like, I think fantasy is such a useful way of kind of thinking about this, because it's like how, you know, when you know, like if you read like fantasy where you feel like you're in the world, that's like, you know, when the world building is really strong. So I suppose it's just about, yeah, trying to like make somewhere like fully fleshed out.
And kind of linking to that, but like how would you you've talked a little bit about sort of a difficult relationship with nature, but how would you write about nature if you're really sort of housebound, you find it really difficult to get out? How would you approach writing about nature in that situation?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got something that I can share, or maybe you can put it in the YouTube links at the end, Anna, because I've got I just wrote a kind of resource pack, a free resource pack to spread the word on this as part of, I'm a writer in residence on one of their projects, and it's all exercises that can be done from within the home. So I think that what I would do is probably do something around, yeah, thinking about what you can see, or if you can't see, what you can kind of hear or like smell or whatever from where you are. So kind of, yeah, thinking about kind of like, I guess, like observing the outside world from inside. But also I think that there's an exercise I really like to do, and I do it quite often in my workshops, is to think about something which in some way has a connection to nature. Ask people to think of something around them now. So like there'll always be something, like it's like if you're wearing a cotton t-shirt, if you have a wooden desk, if you've got eating a banana, like, you know, there's all these things. And then asking that person to kind of like imagine the journey that the object's taken to them, I think can be a really good way of doing it, and kind of starting to think about nature in domestic spaces. And then there's something called, like if someone does want to write about something which is more yeah, like I guess a different place, like we want to kind of like a bit of a there's a website, I can't remember the name now, I'll find it in a minute. It's a really cool website, and I use it in my writing course where and I use it for my own writing, where you can like click it's called Window Swap, sorry, it just came to me. I'm sure people have already heard of it. I'll just post it in the chat now as well. And it's a really great visual writing prompt, and kind of like oral as well, in that you can just click on it and open it, and it will take you to a stranger's window somewhere in the world, and you can click through and find somewhere that you like. So again, that's kind of something that's available to all of us, whether we can leave the house or not, but especially at the moment when we can't really travel, I think that can be a really nice thing to do.
It's great for people. Like immediately what popped into my mind is that I'm just incredibly nosy, so like looking out of people's windows and like stuff like that is really interesting to me, completely separately from
yeah, and I think it's really cool that they are all like actually people's windows that they've just recorded and put up. So yeah, I love it, and I think that could be a really good place to start as well.
Really intriguing. So you have given loads already, but do you have any recommendations for particular nature writers? And I guess I'm like thinking, because you said it's quite male dominated, it's quite sort of white dominated. Are there any sort of like, yeah, any people from like not from those categories that like you could recommend?
Yes, there's a essay I'm going to share in the chat now. So I'm putting it up. By an author called Daisy Niala, who's got a book out of Little Tower next year, I think. And this is an amazing essay. I think if people wanting to read something a bit shorter, when I'm saying that you can write about nature and whatever you want, you can also write about kind of like a journey of learning and discover yourself. I think this is a great example of this because it's very much about the author learning about and kind of becoming a bit of an expert in ladybirds, but she kind of outlines that journey and also talks very much about like anti-Black racism, anti-immigration sentiments and Brexit within that as well. It's an amazing essay. Jessica J. Lee is another author who wrote a really great book called Two Trees Make a Forest, which I love. I think that's very beautiful. And yeah, I would really recommend that to anyone as well. I suppose anyone who's interested in someone who she does have like quite a lot of like plant science expertise, but who can write about that in like a really accessible way and blends it with kind of family history. That's a really beautiful book. And then there's loads of great neurodivergent nature writers out there that come to mind. Dara Mcanulty and Katherine May. I've popped them in the chat as well. There's so many great nature writers. A book that I really want to read that has just come out recently is called I Belong Here by Anitha Sethi, and that's about like a kind of like journey and a walk in response to like an incident of racism like across Britain, and kind of like that sense of claiming and belonging is what I understand it to be about. I haven't read it yet, but I think that looks I'll put that in the chat as well. So yeah, there's some of the books that I've really enjoyed, I suppose, that I would recommend, but there's so many more. I just don't want to overwhelm people with like too many recommendations, and please, if anyone else has read anything recently that they've really loved, I'd love to like want to share in the chat. I'd love to see that too, but those are some recently that I've loved.
That's great, and I guess people can go away, take that as homework, and then when they're done with that they can come back to you for more.
Absolutely.
Kind of switching slightly away from nature writing, can I ask what you're working on now?
Yeah, so I am working on a few different things now. I'm currently redrafting my novel, which is a bit more, I don't know if I can say that much about it now, not because it's like a big secret or anything, just I find it very hard to like give an elevator pitch to my work, but it's a bit more like fun than like I don't know, like I think it's up to every reader to decide which books are fun, but for me it's a bit more like fun, I suppose, than my nature writing, which I think is really important to me, but kind of came from a place of probably feeling quite like sad, and I talk quite a lot about like PTSD and things in it. So that's, I guess, suppose what I was saying about breaks as well, and like the kind of tempo in your own writing and thinking about your own health. So I written that, and then I'm also just putting I've been working on a poetry collection, which is kind of, again, like I've really enjoyed writing it. It's very much like exploring a lot of like games and things that I was like The Sims that I was very obsessed with when I was younger, and like I sort of like using them as a window to write about sexuality. But now I'm really interested in like Irish and Scottish folklore, so I want to write about some poems about that, but I haven't really decided in what way yet. Sorry, that's quite a sprawling answer, but that's what I'm working on at the moment.
No, it's good. It's an honest answer, and like I think it's really good to acknowledge that like as writers it's not always neat, and it's not always like you finish one book and that goes into the world and you write another one. Like actually you're often writing about lots of different things all at the same time.
Absolutely, yeah.
And can I ask, like, what do you do alongside writing?
Yes, definitely. So I do a lot of writing adjacent things, I guess is probably a good way of putting it. So I am really passionate about facilitation, especially like accessibility, and creating more opportunities for other neurodivergent and disabled authors and writers. So I regularly run workshops that I put on myself, and they're always pay what you can, so there's always free places available. And I also do facilitation with organisations. So as I mentioned, I'm currently a writer in residence with Spread the Word for a project called This Is Our Place, which people might be interested in looking into, because it's all about nature writing and kind of like diversifying nature writing. And there's free workshops coming up with that. If anyone's based in London, there's free in-person workshops at some nature reserves in London, but there's also free workshops which are online, which anyone can go to, with myself and the other writers in residence, one of whom is Anitha Sethi, so who I just mentioned. So yeah, I work with organisations like Spread the Word, and I've also got a series, I'll share the link in a minute in case anyone would like to apply for it, but I'm currently got funding from the Royal Society of Literature to run a nature writing course for deaf, disabled and or neurodivergent participants, which of course includes anyone with a mental health issue or anyone who's chronically ill. So I'm really excited for that. So kind of have my facilitation side of things, and then I also do mentoring and working with writers, like, or anyone who's interested in writing. Like, I know it can be scary to call yourself a writer, so really happy to like work with anyone at kind of any level of experience. And I love my kind of mentoring side of things, and always happy to offer discounts to work with people's budgets as well, and kind of provide editorial work as part of that. Or I sometimes do if people approach me like bigger editing projects, but that's not kind of like my main area. It's kind of mainly editing, mentoring and facilitation. So yeah, that's kind of me in a big nutshell.
I like it, thank you. It's really good to like hear about what you do as well as writing, and it sounds like you just do a whole lot of helping other writers, which is lovely. Nice. So we've kind of got to the end of questions, and you said there was another reading. I would love for you to read that.
Sure, yeah, I can share my screen. I've just also popped in the chat there, that's the link to more details about it's called Unnatural, because it's like problematizing the idea of what's natural and what's not. So yeah, if anyone kind of like does identify as any of those groups, either deaf, neurodivergent and or disabled, or having mental health issues in any way, please do apply, because it's all free and there's a paid reading at the end as well. So yeah, please do apply. I'd love to. Will we get to read the work shortlisted for Nan Shepherd's Award? Sue, thanks for that question. Well, the answer to that is I hope so. It's basically the situation with that is that it was a book, which was the first thing I wrote, and it was very lucky to be shortlisted in the Nan Shepherd's Prize, because that kind of launched me into getting my agent I have now. But that book is currently on submission, so it's not really like, you can't read it at the moment because sadly it's not been picked up by a publisher yet. So hopefully it will be, you will be able to read it. But what I can do is I can share an extract with you that you can, I'll pop a link in the chat. It's probably too long for me to read now, but that you can read, and this is like from the first chapter of the book. I'll pop it in the chat now. It was published on Little Toller's blog. I definitely recommend people to check out Little Toller. They were people who first published Dara Mcanulty, whose Diary of a Young Naturalist was a huge book in 2020 and won loads of prizes. Yeah, you're saying Little Toller fab, so yeah, and there's so many amazing writers on the clearing, and that essay is kind of about, to be fair, it doesn't actually encompass a lot of what I was talking about. It's kind of about difficult relationships outdoors, but relationship with my dad, who is he actually is like works in climate crisis work, like he's a scientist, so like, but he's much closer to that than me, but then kind of like feelings of kind of sadness around that, but then hope as well. But anyway, yeah, if anyone reads it and wants to let me know what you think, please do. But I know we've only got a couple of minutes left, so shall I go ahead and do my other reading, Anna?
Yes, please.
Okay, cool. I will just make sure that I've got it up again. Okay, I will share my screen now. Fab. Okay, so this poem is called Wildfires Burn Across Australia as Edward Cullen takes his top off for the 20th time. 1,000 miles away, a country burns as we decide it is time for a twilight marathon. Silvery moon, cold skin in my heart as Bella moves from Phoenix, Arizona, making me see climate refugees even in my YA. We cannot see the flames like bees, we are asleep, smoked out, impervious to our home dissolving. Jacob says to Edward, I'm hotter than you, which is true, but not all things that are true are hard. New moon, breaking dawn, light still crawling, but as the sun cracks its yolk on our popcorn husks, the dead weight in my stomach is undying. Iron cord, an apple wishing its pips will still be seeded, find ground in which to live, that the venomous bite of rubbish, of sewage, of the crushed snail, of the dead wasp on the pavement is not eternal. that the sharp pains in my chest will be eclipsed by action, my own included, and that it was okay, forgive me, to watch Bella and Edward get their happy ending whilst a country burned.
Ah, lovely, Chum.
Thank you.
I love that combination of like you're literally sitting there watching that, and then all the thoughts that you're kind of having and drawing in about something much bigger works so well.
Yeah, and I think going back to what Nadia was saying earlier about like, obviously I know that question was specifically about like how do you write the place, but like it's difficult, isn't it, I suppose, when we're writing about like we're seeing a lot of headlines about a place, or like a lot of headlines about something really big catastrophe, and I think for me that was just a way of writing it for me in that instance. Like it was just like came out all in my notes app as I was saying, is like one thing just like as a response to that, because I don't think it's not always that we have to get into the other place, it's like about responding from where we are.
Definitely. And like you said, responding to your feelings and like how you feel about it and the stuff that you can see, like yeah,
absolutely. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Elspeth, so much for such a great session. I know that I'm going away, I always feel like I go away with like pages of notes, but I feel like I'm going to step outside, and wherever I am now I'm going to be seeing nature and kind of like looking out for that. And like it's so silly when you said about wooden furniture, I was like, oh yeah, that's made from a tree. And that's in my house all the time. So like thank you. Yeah, just such an inspirational and like sort of eye-opening session, I feel like, today. Thank you.
Oh no, thank you so much for having me, Anna, and yeah, thank you to everyone who's come along. As I say, please do stay in touch with me. Yeah, like I'd love to. And if anyone has any comments or wants to get in touch with me, like you can just find where to get in touch with me on my website. And yeah, I hope everyone has a lovely evening, gets to enjoy some more of the sunshine.